Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining this session, and thank you so much to Visit California for this opportunity. It's just great to be invited to speak with all of you today, albeit virtually, in the state where I was born and raised and spent most of my life. So I hope I can be there with you in person next year. My keynote is billed as how 2020 made the case for sustainable tourism. I'm told that my presentation topic was in pretty high demand among participants this year, and I want to applaud all of you and Visit California for giving it such prominence in the midst of this continued crisis that we're all facing. I do believe there have been some silver linings, and I hope to bring a dash of optimism to what is clearly a really difficult moment for all of us. However, I'm not going to spend the next 20 or 30 minutes ticking off all the reasons why this pandemic has created a great reset or helped us to pause and appreciate nature, or buy local and reassess what we value. Although I could share some really compelling global statistics with you from surveys that suggest that consumer and in many cases resident attitudes to sustainable travel have been further strengthened by this pandemic, I'm not going to do that today. In fact, although I'm incredibly passionate about sustainable tourism, I've built my career around it, I'm going to try very hard not to use the term sustainable again for the rest of my presentation. I do this because I'm a bit concerned that sustainability has become largely a marginalized term, and it often leads us to sideline issues that really should be front and center of all of our conversations. At worst, the word can lead to greenwashing, and at best, I think it distracts us from seeing the picture much more clearly. So please, be the first to call me out if I let the S word slip from here on out. Instead, what I want to do is offer you a new vision for the not too distant future, which I hope will resonate with all of you. So imagine a world where travel and tourism is actually the force for good that it always promises it can be. Imagine a world where communities and destination needs are put at the center of tourism management and development, where public, private, and third sectors are united by a shared agenda that's been shaped by communities with their needs and the needs of the destination at the center. Tourism is well understood as something that connects us across sectors and into other aspects of life like no other economic activity on this planet. And so it's developed and prioritized for its contribution to achieving the SDGs. And if you don't know what SDGs stand for, it's that S word followed by development goals. So referring back to the title of my keynote, I do believe that there is a silver lining, an opportunity to do things differently as tourism begins to recover, to reimagine the future of tourism and to create the kind of relationship between tourism businesses and destinations that will add value for both. I'll come back to this vision a bit later in the presentation. So let's start by acknowledging the pandemic has been absolutely devastating for the travel industry. And we're really unlikely to fully understand the true human, economic, and psychological costs for years to come. Many good businesses, many small family-run enterprises have collapsed, struggled, or really hampered now by debt and in dire need of liquidity. Looking globally in the tourism sector, the pandemic has really brought about a devastating cost for communities that we're only now beginning to realize and understand. Changes in both supply and demand have rapidly brought on new and unexpected challenges and pressures, including the fact that some communities last summer were unexpectedly busier than ever, but without the infrastructure to handle it. But it hasn't been all bad. I really do believe that this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to reset and create our own quote-unquote new normal. Although I'm afraid this term is a bit overused now as well, we have seen real evidence of rapid change, some of which would have been really hard to imagine at this time last year. What have we seen globally? We've seen that public and private sectors are recognizing their reliance on each other now more than ever and are showing to collaborate. Destinations all over the world have engaged with their communities and with their residents as primary stakeholders and even as their primary target market. And for some, the absence of tourism has allowed them to consider the benefits and the drawbacks of tourism much more carefully. Visitor flows and carrying capacities are now being considered and managed for social distancing purposes in a way that was truly unthinkable a year ago. In Europe, a place where you couldn't open a newspaper 12 months ago or read online about what was happening in tourism in Europe. without seeing the word over-tourism or hear about the pressures and the fact that communities were starting to have a little bit of a revolution. And here in Europe, we've seen, since the pandemic started, many urban centers and attractions completely rethinking how to manage crowds, creating better experiences. And all evidence points to the fact that businesses and travelers alike feel like this is a better product. And we've also seen that recovery support packages in many cases are prioritizing and even incentivizing social and environmental returns alongside financial ones in order to help diversify and improve the tourism offer, invest in local supply chains, and upgrade infrastructures. So let's not kid ourselves that over the previous decades, with often unfettered year-on-year growth, that everything was perfect and there were no negative impacts. There were many issues. Destinations and businesses all around the world struggling with things like seasonality, economic leakage, low margins, overcrowding, overconsumption, overdependence of communities on tourism, fragile environments, exclusion, and inequity. Each of these vulnerabilities can be thought of as having social, environmental, and economic costs. These costs are rarely accounted for and were exposed in a report that we launched as a travel foundation back in 2019 with our partners Eplerwood International and Cornell University. That report's called Destinations at Risk, the Invisible Burden of Tourism. The invisible burden costs associated with additional demand of visitors on communities might include things like infrastructure required to transport, feed, accommodate, provide energy and water, and manage the waste of tourists and those employed in the tourism sector, protecting and maintaining those shared environmental and cultural assets. And there are often questions about who is responsible ultimately for covering those costs. So in many cases, costs are left unaccounted for, and this leads to resource conflict or tensions with local communities. The underlying fragility of tourism, which, if anything, has only been exacerbated by the pandemic, comes from failing to manage impacts on the destination product, so the place and the assets which are shared with visitors and residents alike. At the Travel Foundation, we've been advocating for the need to reframe success all across the tourism sector, so that it isn't just more marketing, more growth, more tourism for tourism's sake. For a tourism business, it might seem okay to want tourism for tourism's sake. After all, that's why you exist, you may think, to make your customers' dreams come true and to make money and to grow year by year. But as the limitations of a destination begin to be reached or breached, attitudes can change and destinations may begin to ask a simple yet profound question. Why do we want tourism? Now, why do we want tourism seems like a relatively obvious question, but it's one that is rarely fully considered. Many destinations around the world, I look to places like the Netherlands, Scotland, Costa Rica, New Zealand, have started to understand that tourism needs to find its balance and bring about wider, more holistic benefits. So these destinations are searching for another paradigm. I like to make clear at this point that mine is not an anti-growth message. I just believe that we need to understand much better the implications of that growth and manage that growth in a much better way. Many destinations have begun to talk about this in terms like prioritizing value over volume or moving from quantity to quality. In most cases, quality is understood to mean something like higher spending visitors, aiming to stabilize volume and grow value by attracting, let's say, five-star guests. But it isn't the case that higher spenders are always better for a destination. So I think it's important to caution against viewing any particular market segment as inherently undesirable. And there's a bigger question at hand too. Who gets to define value anyway? So instead of focusing on quality tourists, we prefer to focus on the idea of quality tourism. To understand what quality tourism means and how to make it happen, we need to understand the holistic impacts of different types of tourism, both positive and negative, on destinations. Last year at the Travel Foundation, we completed a research study in Tenerife in the Canary Islands, which looked at finding the optimum tourism mix and challenged many of the island's long-held assumptions. The results were pretty transformative for decision makers in terms of where to invest their marketing dollars and what types of destination management interventions to prioritize. We found that certain segments were more valued than others, for example, when it comes to employment generation, having a lower carbon footprint, or helping to smooth out seasonality issues. Importantly, we also found that higher spending tourists almost across the board incurred by far the highest cost for the community, especially in terms of demand for resource use. All destinations with the right data and the right know-how have the opportunity to maximize net value and be smarter about growth as they rebuild their tourism sectors in the coming months and years. But optimizing tourism's impact isn't solely an objective exercise. The terms quality and value are pretty subjective. So what you think of as better tourism may be quite different to what someone else thinks, depending on your perspective and stake in the game. So there's another fundamental question at play here, which is, what do we, the people, value from hosting visitors? Answering this means shaking up the age-old mandate handed to DMOs by their traditional constituencies. And this new mandate puts residents and community needs front and center of destination management. It's not really enough in today's day and age to just market and sell a destination. But a new mandate such as this one requires new goals and new ways of defining what success looks like. This also means more and different sorts of people around the table for a bigger conversation, working towards more of a shared agenda across broader destination issues. For DMOs, this means taking their rightful place at the table for wider placemaking, planning, and development. Destinations are increasingly considering how the visitor economy can support those placemaking goals, but it also means taking a larger role in addressing the big issues of our time. Health and safety, of course, but also things like the climate crisis, natural disasters, economic inequity, and the important conversation that we're all having around race, diversity, and inclusion. Practically speaking, this means we need to reframe success so that communities and residents have a seat at the table in creating a shared vision and agenda for their destination, where success is reframed according to indicators far beyond arrivals or GDP, incorporating things like equitable benefits, inclusivity, quality of life, and tourism's impacts on resources and biodiversity. Businesses, I think, need to be responsive to this and find a shared agenda with their communities as well. Companies are starting to recognize both the risks and the opportunities inherent in their role within the destination ecosystem, risks to the resources and assets that their businesses depend on, and opportunities to innovate and be part of creating awesome new product. And their customers are increasingly telling them too, and these trends are only expected to accelerate because of the situation that we've gone through in the last year. But changes are going to be needed to ensure a fair and level playing field and ultimately create a better, so more local, more diverse, more fair, lower footprint, and ultimately higher quality tourism experience. I think this presents an opportunity for companies to become a more meaningful partner to communities, to be good destination stewards. By forging a new and more meaningful relationship with tourism administrations, with local communities, I think it's possible to create a win-win situation, which results in better product, protection of investments, more resilient supply chains, less regulation, increased competitiveness, better community relations, and most importantly, better collaboration with one another. So back to our vision for this not so distant future. I think by reframing the relationship between the public and private sector, putting destination needs at the heart of tourism development, and building back with a focus on optimizing positive impacts and reducing burdens, visible and invisible, this vision can become our reality. And by the way, this isn't just my vision, but this is one of nearly 500 tourism companies and destinations around the world. Last year, around June, we formed with 6 other international tourism NGOs a new initiative called the Future of Tourism Coalition. And the goal was to align our industry behind a shared vision. In fact, a destination here in California, the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency, was one of the founding signatories to this coalition. We've provided 13 guiding principles to guide our industry toward the vision that I've described here today, and to help us move from platitudes like build back better to concrete action in terms of our recovery efforts and beyond. I encourage you now to join us and become part of the community that will achieve this vision, and you can do so at futureoftourism.org. Through inspiration, connections, and a huge wealth of knowledge and resources that we've been gathering, we'll be working together as a global community that takes practical action to reset and rebalance tourism by putting destinations and communities at the heart of our efforts. So one of the things we'll be working on within the Future of Tourism program is advocating for businesses and destinations alike to reframe success and set measurable targets in critical impact areas. I'm talking about areas like climate action, DEI, equitable economic benefits for communities. I like to call these metrics that matter, so that ultimately we can do a better job industry-wide of being more transparent, making necessary progress, and ultimately creating the evidence base to show that we are indeed a force for good for communities globally. And there are great examples out there of destinations who have put these bold new strategies into place. They've made a serious shift in reframing their mandates and introducing entirely new key performance indicators to guide their strategy and their planning and even their budgeting. If you're interested in learning more about some of these places, I'll point out a few examples now. Have a look at the Netherlands. Over the last couple of years, they developed a bold new vision called Perspective 2030. And during the pandemic have decided to double down on this new vision and ensure that they've got the resources and the plan in place to bring that to life. You could look at Visit Flanders and their Travel to Tomorrow program. You could look at the incredible program of work in the Thompson Okanagan region of British Columbia, which has already resulted in a huge shift in the value of visitors and indeed the quality of tourism, which they've seen in that region over the last 5 years. And here in California, I just had the chance to review Big Sur's bold new destination stewardship plan, which was really great to see because it puts the needs of locals and of environmental protection squarely in the center. So what we've discussed here today is a model for developing and managing tourism that leads to thriving communities and thriving businesses while protecting precious assets and destinations. And by the way, this will be a more sustainable tourism industry, but now at least we know what that word actually means. Thanks very much, and I look forward to answering your questions. All right, well, it looks like it's time for questions. So we've had a few that have come in. Let's start with Amelia from Anaheim is asking, what is this, my sense of the international traveler who will emerge from this COVID era, and what will they demand in terms of sustainable practices at the destinations they visit? This is such a good question, and I think it's the $1,000,000 question in many ways. A lot of people are asking. I have seen quite a few surveys, particularly asking this question around sustainable practices and whether, and this was happening, I think, even before the pandemic, but we're seeing even more this question around how much visitors are looking at sustainability, demanding sustainable practice, either from businesses or from destinations, and how that will affect the choices that they're making. I think it's interesting because oftentimes the surveys usually come back very high. The responses come back very high, that people will say, oh, 80 to 90% of people say that sustainable practices or sustainability in general are an important aspect to their decision making. But I think that it really depends on the way that question is asked. And oftentimes I think to myself, well, who wouldn't say that that's important to them? Most people these days have built that into their values and are claiming this is important. Whether or not that actually shows up in their decision making and their pocketbook, I think is a different story. So what we're seeing, particularly from the bigger companies that we work with, is that they're really doubling down on a couple of key aspects. The first thing that everyone is looking at is nature. It seems like, and just outdoor experiences. It seems like that has certainly been something that's been emphasized within our own lives, our reconnection to nature, to being able to spend time outside in open spaces. We even saw, last summer, that some of the national parks and public lands were seeing even more visitation than they had before the pandemic. So I think that's an aspect that will continue. The other characteristic that companies in particular seem to be doubling down on are around local and support for communities. I think it's really interesting to reflect on the pandemic and the connection that many people have felt to local communities, wanting to support their own community, wanting to support small businesses, wanting to buy local in terms of product, but really feeling that sort of connection. It'll be really interesting to see whether and how that translates to how people travel. But I can tell you that many companies are really thinking about it and investing in local in terms of how they're thinking about their strategies, and destinations as well, who have had to adapt in some cases to thinking about domestic travelers as domestic travelers as a stakeholder, or residents and local communities as a stakeholder or even a customer, are really thinking about how to make this adaptation. What's going to be even more interesting is to see how well people are able to adapt. I don't think there's necessarily a quick fix, just as there wasn't a quick fix. Many destinations in Europe in particular were really trying to adapt their strategies to focus on domestic visitors only, but that's not something that can happen overnight. So I think there's a need to build the capacity and the strategies and the infrastructure that are going to be required to make that pivot in the long run. Let's see, another question is around from Eduardo in Los Angeles, asking, you mentioned businesses and destinations are struggling with exclusion and inequality. What is one thing they should do first to address this? First of all, I don't think that there is necessarily a quick fix when it comes to this issue. The thing that comes to my mind first is to make sure, and I mentioned this in my presentation, many companies, destinations are really rethinking what success looks like, trying to frame up, what success looks like when you're thinking beyond growth. And one of the KPIs, key performance indicators, that we are seeing most commonly now is an indicator around how much money is staying local, and how much local communities are actually benefiting from tourism. So for me, this is one of the first things that needs to happen, is that this needs to be one of the key measures of success going forward. Then, of course, there's a lot of work to do to think about, from a product development perspective, how to ensure that local people are, and underserved communities are being brought into the tourism value chain, all the way up to the promotional strategies that are going to be needed. And I think many places don't necessarily know how to communicate or promote communities that they're not used to promoting within their typical within their typical promotional campaigns. So I think there's going to be a lot of work to do to change that systemically. But to me, it starts with making sure that there are indicators alongside the traditional economic ones that demonstrate how equality and inclusion can be built into the future that companies and destinations are framing up for themselves. I have a good question here from Christine Sarkis, asking to profile a bit more the idea of a quality traveler. What are the characteristics of a traveler who supports a sustainable destination? This is something I think about a lot, because I don't really believe that the term quality traveler actually makes a lot of sense in every single context. I don't think you can define quality in the same way. So I think it's really up to destinations and companies to define what quality means within their own context. In some of the research that we've done, there have been assumptions made about what quality travelers look like. Oftentimes it has to do with how much people are spending, or how much money that they are leaving behind in a destination, but it often lacks nuance in terms of really understanding the full picture of the costs and benefits of those particular travelers. So for me, I think it's much more interesting to think about it as quality tourism rather than quality travelers. And if we think about it from the perspective of quality tourism, and we don't assume that any particular market segment is inherently or necessarily not quality, then that puts the onus back on destinations and on companies to think about, who is it that is visiting our destination? Who makes sense given our DNA and our strategic objectives and our key performance indicators, and how do we best serve them? How do we best maximize the potential benefits that they bring to our community, and how do we understand their behaviors well enough and the potential costs and impacts that they may bring with them to be able to manage a quality tourism experience that mitigates that potential negative impact. So for me, the answer is more around quality tourism and really thinking through how we can introduce the right behaviors so that people are maximizing the potential quality that they may bring. Let's see. We've got a question from Heather. Heather from the Ranch Restaurant and Saloon. Thank you for the mention of a shift in paradigm away from more. You're welcome. For California businesses, what do you think is a good goal in answering why do we want tourism? Again, I think it is a bit of an individual question, because I don't think there is one specific answer. And the way that I think about quality or value or some of these loaded terms may not be the way that you do within your own context. And this may vary from community to community, but I think it's really critical to think about tourism as a means rather than an end. So what can tourism be a means to do? If we think about tourism as a means to help regenerate resources, if we think about tourism as a means to create economic opportunities for local people, if we think about tourism as an opportunity to enhance communities, to enhance culture, and to really contribute to what makes a place by making it special, then I think we're starting to ask the right questions. If you flip it on its head and you think that the answer is just tourism for tourism's sake, or at the end of the day, the goal is to have tourism rather than to have a thriving community, then I think that's where it gets a bit problematic. So here, I think there are lots of opportunities to build in thoughts of how do we utilize tourism to address the climate crisis? How do we use tourism to create value for our natural spaces so that people are more interested to protect them? These are the questions that I would really think make sense to start asking. And again, it depends on the place, really. Let's see. Scott Wayne from Washington, D.C. is asking if I could please comment on how the pandemic has increased awareness of the close linkages between climate change and resilience and tourism development, especially at a community level. Sure. I think that if there's anything that this pandemic has done, it has raised awareness about the fact that there is significant risk, not only, of course, to tourism, I mean, to our economic systems, to our society. And I think one of the biggest barriers to change really has been, all along, has been mindset. But here we are with a moment where we've all sort of been through something that has raised our awareness about the fragility of our ecosystem, and particularly when it comes to tourism. I mean, communities all over the world that are dependent on tourism, and here we are seeing in many cases what happens when tourism goes away, or what happens when the resources, the assets that we depend on are no longer there. So what I think it's done, actually, and it's pretty amazing. I've been working really closely through the Future of Tourism Coalition with another initiative called Tourism Declares a Climate Emergency. And the momentum that's being built through these movements and through Tourism Declares, which now has 200 or so signatories, several destinations now coming on board. I was pretty concerned when this started that we would lose momentum on some of these issues, but I think the opposite has proven true, and people are waking up to the fact that there is risk that we need to manage going forward. This is probably not going to be the last crisis. And therefore, I see more and more, probably more than ever before, destinations and companies really thinking about how do we manage risk? What is the business case here that we need to be aware of? How do we grow in a way, grow back, or grow from here in a way that helps us really understand the implications of growth and be more aware that there are resources and assets that are and sort of livelihoods that are at risk. So I'm really proud to see just the progress that's actually been made, and how many companies, governments that we're talking to on a daily basis are taking this seriously and now baking climate and climate action into their strategies. And by the way, my last comment, then I know I need to wrap up, is that I don't think you can separate the issue of climate and climate action from the question about equality and inclusion. I think the two are quite linked. And actually what we're looking at here is making sure that we're protecting economic opportunities for communities and the very resources that they depend on. And this will be the issue that we need to continue to work on together as a tourism industry. So it looks like I need to wrap up now. There were a lot of questions I didn't get to answer, but I'd be happy to continue the conversation anytime. And thank you very much for the opportunity to be here with you today.